This one's about the synthesis essay. Now, the only real difference between the synthesis essay and the open argument prompt is the need for you to use three of the sources that they provide. Now, apart from that, you're just like the open argument prompt. What you have to do is you have to figure out what kind of claim do they want from you, right? Do they want a policy claim? Do they want a claim of truth, a claim of cause and effect, a claim of definition? Typically, though, historically, the way they've formatted these, or the ones that they've thrown at people the most, are the policy prompts. And they come in two flavors. It'll ask you, what are the things you should consider, or what factors should you consider, or what issues should you think about before making a decision on X. Now, it sounds kind of weird, but it's still a policy because it's asking you the things you have to think about first before you do anything else, right? So it's a should, shouldn't you statement. Sometimes it'll be more direct and it'll be like, hey, should we get rid of daylight savings time, or give a recommendation on daylight savings time? Some funny wordings that they'll sometimes use to elicit a claim of truth from you is they'll say, evaluate this to see if it's worth it or not, right? So if you're evaluating something, typically what you're doing is you're figuring out, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing, right? And then, we did get that one prompt that we used it as an example for the effects of advertising. Now, that's not to say that they can't throw some sort of weird prompt that asks you to provide a claim of definition. It just hasn't happened yet. But I mean, if it does happen, everyone will be thrown for a loop. Just do the best that you can. But otherwise, plan for it like you would a typical open argument prompt, with the exception of having to use three of the sources they provide. Now, after you read it and you determine what kind of prompt that you need to provide, then you need to think, well, what kind of considerations should I use? Is this going to be more about the relationships? Is this going to be more about setting? Is this going to be more about individuals? Chances are, historically, the synthesis paper has been more concrete than the open argument prompt. So they'll talk about eminent domain, or the post office, or space shuttles, or they'll talk about things that are just more practical and more based on the real world, right? So you just kind of think like, what is this probably going to be about? What should I probably think about, right? And then you actually read the sources, and even though you've already thought about what might pop up, leave yourself open to inspiration. Maybe the source brings in the concept of happiness and you didn't even think about that, right? And then eventually, after you read through all the sources and have annotated all of them, taking note of the arguments and claims and the considerations that pop up, you want to narrow down the lenses you're going to be using. And then typically after that, you're going to make a chart, just like the ones we've made in class. And then you would plan for it like you would an argument essay, but with a special, with special attention to using the sources as your evidence for your claims that you develop. Now, alternatively, if you're the kind of person that has a hard time not stealing arguments from the sources, you probably want to plan for your argument first, like you would an argumentative essay, after you determine the kind of claim they want. Then read the sources and then adjust your plan accordingly as things pop up, right? But again, this isn't the first time you're hearing this. This is just a refresher. Now, typically, the sources come in four flavors, right? You're going to have the text-based source, you're going to have the comic or the political cartoon, you're going to have a chart or graph, and then you're going to have a photograph or still painting or something that's pretty neutral. Now, there are different ways to handle each of these, right? The first one, and the most common one, is the text-based source. And those are tricky. Those are a little bit tricky because these tend to have a point of view. And these will actually give you claims that you could easily, accidentally rip off as your own. So, you read through it, you annotate it for ideas and cornerstones and values and things that show up. But then if it does have a point of view, you do want to note, like, hey, is this for the thing that the prompt is asking for? Or is this against the thing, or some combination of the two, right? And if it gives you a claim that actually answers the prompt, you really want to make note of that and make sure you don't steal that and try to pass it off as your own, okay? The other most common type is the comic or political cartoon. They like to shove this like near the end for some reason. This is just like the text based sources in the sense that it tends to have a point of view. So you would say, hey, is it for or against the thing, if that's the kind of claim type it's asking for. But these typically deal more with the human element because comics operate in pathos, it'll deal with fear and confusion or joy or irony, right? So it'll kind of make it more personal. So even like typically the text will make it more abstract and make it more like official and governmental or, technical. Comics tend to be more personal on the day-to-day front, right? Now, these are the hardest ones in the sense that you can easily steal arguments from these things, but the other two, I think, are the best sources to use because it's almost impossible to steal arguments from them. But for whatever reason, they're the most underutilized. So I highly recommend, if you see charts and graphs and pictures, I say have at it, man. I doubt, not a lot of people use them as much as they use the text or the comics. So when it comes to charts and graphs, it's just typically giving you data, right? And it doesn't interpret it for you. That's not to say that it never will. Sometimes a source will give you a chart or graph and then there'll be an interpretation. But historically, there's usually no text apart from the things you need on the X and Y axis in the title to let you know what's going on. The thing about data is it needs interpretation, which is great because that's up to you and you get to decide how to use that data. Same thing with, the pictures, right? The pictures tend to focus on objects, materials, resources, space, interaction, time, weather, that kind of stuff, which are all great because it's not being explicit about it. You have to determine whether it's a good thing or a bad thing or what considerations are showing up there. There's room for interpretation. So my recommendation is to always use the charts and graphs and pictures whenever you can, and then to either use the text or the comic to give you context or to humanize it. But again, use what works for you depending on what the prompt is asking for, okay? Now, once you've actually settled on which sources you're going to use, you're going to have to organize them by lens or by topoi, right? Is there a lot of sources focusing on safety, or are there a lot of sources dealing with space or safety or cost, right? Cluster them together so you know like which lens you're probably going to end up using. And then that'll kind of give you an idea of what values you're going to have to bring up. So don't forget that the synthesis prompts are conversations and all the sources have entered the conversation before you. So it's really up to you to figure out how can I combine these to come up with something new. Now, the recommendation I gave in class is to actually think about what you value, right? And to use your values as the scales to balance the competing considerations of the sources. So in this example here, it's about universal currency, right? One source could talk about the cost of developing it, but another source could also talk about space and location and time, right? And maybe your value of fairness would allow you to use both of those. So you would sit there and say, we should all switch to universal currency because it would be more fair, right? Because one, we could see what everyone's paying for, and two, it would actually possibly keep the prices the same from location to location. So it's about the concept of fairness. So you're basically abstracting up from the considerations here based off of the topic. Let me give you another example, right? So here's another one, right? We've talked about in class. Maybe your value is happiness, right? So you could have a source that talks about cost and profit, but one that talks about culture and identity. So you could sit there and say, hey, source A talks about you saving money or making more money, but source B is more about retaining it. So between those two competing things, the thing that's probably going to make you happiest is source B, right, is more about culture and identity. So your claim is actually based off of happiness. It's not just about based on culture identity. So you're now synthesizing the two sources without stealing from their arguments and making those arguments your own. Now, another example here, you could talk about the value of profit. One could be safety, but the source could be talking about safety and the other source could be talking about efficiency. You can sit there and say like, well, look, source B makes things more efficient, which eventually will lead to greater profits usually, right? So again, that's just one way to avoid stealing the arguments. Like, again, that's a strategy if you're having difficulty. If you just naturally come up with your own arguments, like, don't mess with perfection, just like do what you do. But if you have a hard time not just repeating what considerations you see the source is dealing with, you need to bring in your own values. And those typically allow you to come up with an original argument. So once you do that, it does take a little bit more explaining than a typical open response argument prompt. You'll have your topic sentence, you'll have your enthymeme. Then you have to like bring in the source and maybe combine it with some personal evidence and then explain. And then bring in the other source, combined with personal evidence, and then explain some more, right? Like, and if you can't bring in personal evidence, that's fine. Just make sure you're using a minimum of 2 sources or a source and personal evidence within a body paragraph to show that you're synthesizing, okay? Now, what that typically looks like, here's an example. You'll see that here is the evaluative prompt, right? College can be worth the cost if it will allow you to earn enough to recoup the cost, and it is not worth it for some vague notion of culture. And then that weird claim here that kind of has 2 parts to it will allow me to synthesize one source and another. One source talks about personal growth and development, and the other source just talks about making more money. But the argument is about balance, in the sense, like, it's not just about making more money, it's about recouping the cost. It's about not actually spending any money on it at all. That's when it's worth it, because the extra earnings would allow you to pay for it, so it pays for itself. That's when it's worth it. And it's never worth it just to become more mature or to grow intellectually, right? So you can read this example here to kind of show you it kind of follows the structure here. You have your topic sentence, you have the source and personal evidence with some explanations, another source with some personal evidence, and some explanations here, right? So the yellow is kind of the original argument. The boldface type is the use of the source. The pink is personal evidence or examples, right? And then everything else that's not identified as part of the explanation, okay? So just keep in mind that you could also use the sources in your rebuttals and refutations. Using a lot of sources is great, but typically having a clear, logical, sound argument with 3 sources is better than a bad argument that uses 5 to 6 to 7 sources. But again, it's called the synthesis essay for a reason. They're testing you on your ability to synthesize sources without, stealing arguments. Again, this isn't the first time you've seen a video on synthesis. If you need actual help on this, talk to me, or go back to one of the previous units where all of the videos were actually about the little micro decisions for synthesis essays. This is just an overview. All right, that's it. High five for learning. Ask me questions in class.